hope, who would have thought a decade ago that somebody who declares himself a socialist could come that close to getting the Democratic nomination? Sadly, it seems unlikely he'll actually get it, but I'm absolutely delighted. It gives us hope, and it is part of, undoubtedly, there is an upsurge internationally of popular reaction against the absolutely massive inequalities in wealth, which have grown and grown in Western society over the last couple of decades. And of course, you would expect there to be such a reaction. It would be strange if there wasn't eventually a reaction. And Sanders and Corbyn have benefited from that, and I would argue that to a certain extent the SNP also benefits from that. Ordinary people, for very good reasons, are finding themselves more and more dissatisfied with the system in which they live, in which they see the wealth which is created by ordinary people going off and being monopolized by a tiny clique. So, yeah, we are seeing a revolutionary mood in politics. The dark side of it, of course, is that people who are misled by the corporate media tend to express that resentment sometimes in support for Trump, in support in the UK for UKIP. And I mean, in both cases, it is demonstrably proven that the support for Trump and support for UKIP here is largely from less educated people. They perceive in some ways the same grievances the way the rest of us perceive, but they don't know how to focus and channel them. And I do believe that there is a deliberate double blind here being played by the establishment, because it's very easy to focus the discontent of less educated people using xenophobia and racism. So if somebody has difficulties in their life, not enough money, not good education, rather than blaming, the extremely wealthy, the small clique of extremely wealthy people who are sucking all the money out of the system and sucking all the wealth to themselves using state structures to facilitate that, they blame foreigners, they blame immigrants, and this stoking up of xenophobia, which is obviously, Trump's main weapon, and is also UKIP's main weapon. This is very scary, and I believe it's very cynical and quite deliberate.
Yeah, I mean, you can see it, but it's not necessarily a new thing. It's sort of, in certain ways, it's an unpopular point to make. But I can't remember what book it was in. But George Orwell wrote an article one time about he went with a group of sort of left-wing people in order to disrupt an Oswald Mosley rally, like specifically there to try and break the thing up, cause a fuss. And he was appalled that more than half of the people that he went with ended up cheering Mosley by the end of it.
Yeah, that is that is quite scary. It's also interesting, the ability of the British ruling class to survive and prosper. I was horrified a few years back when I discovered that Oswald Mosley's son is the chairman of Formula One and worth hundreds of millions. I'm not sure if he still is, but he certainly was a few years back.
No, he's not involved anymore.
But again, the fact that it obviously didn't do the family any harm, and they remained part of the ultra rich elite, is scary.
I'm pretty sure the Queen Mother invited Mosley to dinner at the Buckingham Palace, but I need to have that checked out.
Well, I think there's no doubt whatsoever about the support of the royal family, or certainly many of the royal family, for fascism in the 1930s. And of course, it was a great deal wider in the aristocracy, and particularly there's an awful lot of it in the Scottish aristocracy, which is why Hess flew here, because he was under misapprehension as to the social and political importance of the Scottish aristocracy, where he knew he had support.
You were someone obviously very involved with the establishment, the government, and the different bureaucracies. And I always wondered, because people are saying that, now these movements of Sanders and Corbyn, in some ways, it's sort of become an electoral arm of, the anti-war movements and the Occupy and stuff like that. And there's sort of two questions there. One, do you think that's true, that these movements have grown into this sort of electoral arm? And two, when you're in those kind of government bureaucracies, a lot of people say, like the anti-Iraq protests had no effect because they did it anyway, or the Occupy because the bankers got their deals anyway. But I mean, does it cause any consternation in these organisations, or is it just business as usual and they ignore it?
On the first, I mean, to some extent, you can see, for example, with Corbyn, you could trace individual personnel who've come out of the anti-war movement and moved into Labour politics and into positions within Labour politics. So there's some truth in that they are the same kind of people and the same kind of ideas driving both. But it's also true that both the great anti-war movement, the Occupy protests, climate change protests, and other things are all part of a movement for change, and the Corbyn and Sanders phenomena are also part of a movement for change. There doesn't need to be a direct linkage between the two. On the establishment, no, but by and large, the establishment are very cut off from the feelings of ordinary people. I was in the Foreign Office still at the time of the great demonstration against the war in Iraq when millions of people marched through London, and I can say it didn't affect the consciousness of members of the Foreign Office at all. I found the whole situation very weird, as you know, that was a time when I left, resigned, or was kicked out, whichever way you want to. Officially, I was made redundant. In fact,
is it like a football manager thing, mutual consent?
Football manager thing. Jack Straw declared his confidence in me, so it was obviously time to go. I left over the war in Iraq and over the extraordinary rendition and torture program that was going on at the same time and related to it. And I found the ability of people who are inside the establishment to isolate themselves and put themselves in a bubble and not pay attention to what's actually going on really chilling. And I want to give you this thought. And when it comes to extraordinary rendition, there we were sending people abroad in the certain knowledge they were going to be tortured. And people were actually administering that. You had people like the guy, unfortunately I can't remember his name, he moved on to become a senior executive in Shell after he left the Foreign Office in MI6. And he was organising and collaborating with Gaddafi's people, doing the physical arrangements for sending them across, knowing for certain they would be tortured, quite possibly to death, when they got to the other end. It was happening all over the place. I stumbled across the extraordinary. I wasn't asked actually to have anything to do with organising it, but I happened to come across the extraordinary rendition program while I was in Uzbekistan. In fact, because one of the CIA pilots who was flying people in to be tortured told me about it in a pub. That was how I actually learned, strangely enough. But as soon as I learned about it, that was the start of me leaving the Foreign Office because I wasn't prepared to go along with this. There were hundreds of people in the Foreign Office and MI5 and MI6 who were facilitating sending people off to be tortured and killed. And they just did it. They just did it as part of their job. And I've still never ever got my head around that. And if just imagine you're working in a bureaucracy, and the Foreign Office or MI6 or MI5 may sound glamorous, but it's a bureaucracy. And you've got various jobs coming over your desk, bits of paper, meetings to go to and things, and you get something saying, please send this guy off here. And you know that you're sending him off in order to be killed. Will you just do it? Will you just, write the emails, send it off, and phone someone up and organize the dispatch? And the weird thing is that, 99%, over 99% of people, and these are ordinary, decent people, many of whom I know personally and they were my friends, just do it. The very, very strange establishment mindset is something I've never been able to understand. I asked one senior person in the Foreign Office, who was a good friend of mine, how he managed to keep doing the job when he knew he was saying things that weren't true. And in the specific instance was about Iraqi weapons of mass destruction, where I said, you know that these things don't really exist. You're putting out stuff about them all day long. And he said, I think of it like a video game. When you're playing a video game, you're immersed in it, and that is your reality. So as soon as I walk out of a Foreign Office and I've left work, I know there are no weapons of mass destruction. And if you ask me, I'll tell you there are none. And we can talk about it. I'll even joke about it. When I go into the office, I'm in the game, and in the game there are weapons of mass destruction. And that seemed to me a very, very strange way of compartmentalizing your life, because you're playing a game in which real people die, which is not good. I'm sorry, Michael. I've witted on there about things I've worried about for years.
No problem. You reminded me of I think it was Herbert Asquith that said the War Office kept three sets of figures: one to deceive the public, one to deceive the parliament, and another to deceive itself.
Yeah, well, people do manage to deceive themselves, and they manage to live with themselves after they do terrible things, and to keep on doing it. And that gave me an insight. It's a cliche now, but it was a very, very good insight. The banality of evil, the fact that just as people were prepared to organize railway transport for sending people off to die in the Holocaust, they were just ordinary people doing it. And the people sending people off to extraordinary rendition and torture were just ordinary people, the people who knew damn well that they were promoting lies about weapons of mass destruction in order to create a war in Iraq. They were just ordinary people too. And I say the amazing thing is these are people I know. Many of them were my friends. Some of them still are my friends. And yet there's this extraordinary disjunction between us.
There's a strange disjunction here as well because, some of those flights went through Scottish airports, I believe. And I can see why the Labour administration in the Scottish Parliament wouldn't want to mention it because it was their Labour government at the UK level that was doing this or colluding with it. But I have never quite understood why the SNP haven't made more show of it. The only thing I can think of is that maybe, they're trying to keep America on side, even though America isn't on side.
Yeah, I think that's partly true. And you've got to remember, of course, that the SNP voted to stay in NATO. The what I might call the Angus Robertson wing of the party is very CIA friendly. Let me put it that way to you. And the SNP last week did not oppose and vote against the Snoopers Charter in Parliament. The most draconian surveillance powers of any Western country passed through Westminster Parliament last week, and the SNP didn't vote against it. So on these issues, that power corrupts, and the SNP is a governing party which has a certain amount of power, and it wants to be in with the establishment, in with the security services. So I'm sorry to say I'm not surprised.
That brings us back a bit closer to home because I know you said you didn't want to talk about little transfers of powers, but we did have Dugdale at the weekend coming on stage and saying, yes, the new powers exist and we need to use this new all singing, all dancing Scottish Parliament to fix everything, which they're going to do and the SNP are not. But I mean, do you have any thoughts about the transfer of powers? To me, it seems minuscule, and possibly even a booby trap. I don't know.
I don't care. I really don't care. For me, it's just a diversion from independence. I'm not at all interested in whether or not there's a penny on or off income tax if the Westminster government can still sign us up to go and fight and die in illegal wars. That's a much, much bigger question. I actually live right next door to the Scottish Parliament, quite literally in the next building to it. And I don't really care at all what they do there. It's just a glorified council, and it's not interesting to me.
But you must admit that the transfer of the power of road signage got to the very core of your political beliefs.
Yeah, that's one I often use as a kind of joking reference to why I don't care. No, these are matters of division of power within the UK, and it's just not my thing.
But however, on your site, you did write that you were possibly interested in running for the Scottish Parliament. Would you like to tell us how that's going?
Yeah, I think at the moment I'm probably not interested in running for the Scottish Parliament. I was thinking about it after I left the SNP. I was thinking that one way to campaign for independence would be to stand for the Parliament purely on the platform of independence, nothing else, and use the facilities you get as a candidate, for example, delivery of addresses by the post office and that kind of thing, use that platform simply to campaign for independence. But I would require, obviously, quite a lot of assistance, both practical and financial, in order to do that. And I just perceived very little enthusiasm from people in response. And that's probably understandable because you've got plenty of other people doing it. You've got Rise and Solidarity, and I do wish they'd stop opposing each other. You've got the Green Party, who I'm not sure, they seem slightly less ambiguous on independence nowadays, but I'm still not quite certain I will give them a vote at all because I'm insufficiently convinced of their stance for independence. But it just seems to me that there are plenty of people without me trying to take a hand.
So the last little thing is that you've been on the show before, so you've already had the opportunity to choose the song to finish with, but this is your